So it's 6 o'clock and I would like to welcome you all. We are getting more people into this Zoom room, so we will just wait a couple of seconds so that people can get into the Zoom. So I would like to welcome you all to this webinar on new regulations of global trade and the case of South America. Så bienvenidas y bienvenidos, välkomna till detta webinar. Today we are very happy to present ongoing research conducted by Maria-Therese Gustafsson, who is an assistant senior lecturer at the Department of Political Science, Stockholm University. And we have Almut Schilling-Wackerflor, who is a postdoc at Osnabrück University. And as commentators, we have Tim Bartley, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Sociology at Stockholm University, and also Tiago Reis, who is about to defend his PhD in land system and science in Belgium. And my name is Christina Alneval, and I hold the function as a research secretary at the Nordic Institute of Latin American Studies at Stockholm University. And I am the organizer of the open seminars at the Institute, and I have the pleasure to moderate today's webinar. I will shortly just say something about the Institute. And this Nordic Institute of Latin American Studies conducts and promotes research concerning Latin American and the Caribbean. The Institute is part of Stockholm University and was actually established already in 1951. Since 2 years, the Institute became the Nordic Institute of Latin American Studies, which means that it's a node of Latin American research and researchers in the Nordic countries. As such, we have also a lot of students, of course, at all levels, and it includes a bachelor program and master program in Latin American Studies. So we arrange webinars online, and we are soon going to have physical seminars at our library, which is one of the biggest libraries on Latin American literature in Europe. And this is actually the first seminar this semester. And I will post in the chat where you can find our schedule for the next upcoming webinars. So this webinar is approximately 1 hour, and please, audience, we encourage you to post questions and comments in the chat function at the bottom of the screen, and I will forward them to the panel. So by saying that, I would like to welcome Maria-Therese and Almut, and you will present your ongoing research. And after that, Tim and Tiago will comment, and we will have a discussion about this very interesting topic. So the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much, Christina, for organizing this event. I'm very happy that we could present our research and discuss it with you here today. And also thank you so much to Tiago and Tim for accepting our invitation. So I will try to share my screen first. Sure. So in the recent past, there has been a trend where European states and the European Union have adopted new regulations aimed at addressing the negative impacts of global trade. And these regulations would make companies responsible for the negative impacts of their subsidiaries and their suppliers in producing sites. There are, for instance, 2 law proposals that are being debated at the EU level, and Germany adopted such a law earlier this year, and France has a law in place since 2017. And today we will talk about our ongoing research about what these new regulations means in terms of holding companies into account for human rights violations and environmental damage in producing sites. So transnational companies are, of course, very powerful actors, and they account for about half of global exports today and about 1/4 of global employments. And many small and medium-sized enterprises are also linked to the global supply chains. However, it has been very difficult to hold companies to account for the companies that import different products to account for the negative impacts that are caused by their suppliers or subsidiaries in the producing sites. So we will take 2 examples from our ongoing research. First, in the context of the soy and beef export from Brazil to Europe. There is plenty of evidence that these sectors are associated with severe human rights and environmental problems. Together with palm oil, they account for the largest share of imported deforestation in Europe. In fact, there are research that has shown that about 50% of the Brazilian beef are likely to be linked to deforestation. And last year, Brazil used over 60 tons of highly toxic pesticides that are not allowed to use in the European Union. Brazil is also a country where there have been with most killings of environmental defenders, and the situation has only become worse with Bolsonaro. Another case is the Peruvian mining sector, which is also associated with severe social and environmental impacts in mining localities. And given that the mining sector plays a critical role in the low carbon transition, mineral extraction is predicted to increase significantly in the coming years. And at the same time, the mining sector is also sensitive to, or even extremely sensitive to different types of climate risk. It requires a lot of water, and it is very toxic waste are stored. And if these kind of storage of toxic waste burst, there could be accidents that could have very negative impacts on local communities. There have been different sort of voluntary measures for addressing these climate risks, but these have rarely taken local communities' exposure to this risk sufficiently into account. And both of these examples, we argue, highlights the insufficiency of private and voluntary standards for addressing the human rights violations and environmental damage in producing sites. So then, to govern complex supply chains where many actors are involved is indeed challenging. There are different jurisdictions that are involved, and with countries that do not always share histories of collaborating with each other. There are also divergent interest on how to distribute the cost and benefits between different actors in the supply chain. And governments that may be keen on protecting the environment in their own countries may also tend to displace the kind of negative externalities of the citizens' consumption pattern to other countries, often in the global south. And in addition, there is also a lack of knowledge of the sort of impacts and it's very difficult to sort of trace them back to specific companies. So there's a lot of challenges of trying to govern this, so, which explains the accountability gap and the governance gaps. So there have been attempts to create binding international regimes and conventions, but there has been quite a lot of company lobbying, and these attempts have largely failed. But there are at the same time the soft norms, such as the United Nations Guiding Principles that was adopted in 2011. And these are sort of the basis of many new supply chains regulations that have been adopted recently. And in the absence of binding international regimes or conventions, there's also been a proliferation of voluntary private regulations and standards, but many times, as there is plenty of research that shows that these have suffered from significant shortcomings. And researchers and policymakers therefore argue that there is a need for legal obligations on the companies. And more recently, there have been, and this is actually the focus of our research, that there have been a trend of adopting new supply chains regulations in the home countries of the companies. So we'll show a table here with a little overview of these different types of regulations. And the first regulations, sort of trying to categorize them a little bit in the first wave of regulations, so to speak, were focused on environmental issues. Such as they were focused on deforestation, the European timber regulation, on illegal fishing, or on biofuels, such as in the Renewable Energy Directive. More recently, there has been supply chain regulations that are focusing more on human rights, and among them are the Modern Slavery Act, the Conflict Mineral Regulation, and the Dutch Child Labor Act. And then we have a different sort of set of regulations that sort of includes both human rights and the environment. And there we have recent regulations such as the French duty of vigilance law and the supply chain due diligence law from Germany that was adopted earlier this year. And if we think about the kind of problems that we mentioned with the climate risk in the mining sector, for instance, regulations such as the conflict mineral regulation is insufficient because in these cases, the human rights and environmental issues are so intrinsically linked. So I will just very briefly say a few words of our sort of theoretical framework that we use for analyzing the drafting and the implementation of supply chain regulations law. We use the term foreign corporate accountability for that refer to the accountability of companies for the negative impacts caused abroad by their subsidiaries or suppliers. And we argue that these kind of, to what extent foreign corporate accountability could be enhanced are related to different contextual conditions. First, there is ideas and discourses through which the responsibility of companies are contested and framed in different ways. Second, actors and power are really important in shaping both the drafting and the implementation of these laws. And finally, institutions, both at the demand and supply side, matters for why certain countries adopt more ambitious laws than others, but also for the implementation. It matters a lot, the sort of domestic regulatory context in producing sites. We also argue that the institutional design of these laws are very important because they vary a lot, as Almut should explain a little bit more. So just to say very, very briefly before I pass the word to Almut, many of these laws are based on a due diligence approach to just define what this concept means. And according to the United Nations Guiding Principles, due diligence should include assessing actual and potential human rights impact and integrating and acting upon the findings, tracking responses, and communicating how impacts are addressed. So this is basically the type of regulation that we will talk a little bit more. And just to say very, very briefly, to translate the United Nations Guiding Principles into national legislation has been a highly politicized process. And the civil society organizations, they have demand more stringent corporate obligations, whereas corporate actors have been in favor of more restrictive interpretations of mandatory due diligence, which is mainly a reporting obligation that builds on and legitimizing basically the kind of existing corporate social responsibility practices. Okay, so now I hand over the word to Almut.
Okay, thank you very much, Maria-Therese. I will continue. I'm just noticing that my light here is very yellow. I'm in the house of my parents. I hope it doesn't distract so much. Okay, I will start. Despite much cross-referencing between the different laws and lawmaking processes, we actually see very interesting varieties in the design of supply chain regulations. So here in the slide, you can just see a table on the different measures established in the laws for enabling their enforcement. The regulations that you see on the top of the table contain more enforceability measures, while the ones below can be described as being rather teethless. And in the following, we will briefly discuss the laws that score higher regarding their enforceability and that have been of particular relevance for the supply chains from Brazil and Peru that we focus on. Can you change the slide, please? Thank you. We start with the European Union Timber Regulation, which is one of the older regulations. And it relies on an approach that verifies the legality. So this means that it requires the documentation that timber imported into the union market complies with the laws of the producing country. And in the meantime, there has been much evidence that this approach has been problematic in contexts like Brazil, where on the one hand, we have some important laws that are insufficient in many respects for protecting the environment or human rights. And on the other hand, we have law enforcement that has been very weak. Moreover, under the current President Bolsonaro, the implementation of the timber regulation has been particularly difficult. So to illustrate this, we selected a quote from a competent authority from a member state of the European Union for supervising the compliance with the timber regulation. So maybe you can just go through it quickly. Okay. Then Maria-Therese and I also studied the compliance of French companies with the duty of vigilance law that was adopted in 2017. According to this law, only very large companies with over 5,000 employees are covered. And this means that the law has not really established a level playing field for all companies. Our findings presented here quite briefly mainly rely on the analysis of the vigilance plans of French companies involved with soy and beef supply chains from Brazil and semi-structured interviews with civil society organizations. So in a nutshell, we found that some companies are still struggling to exactly understand what due diligence means. So they keep talking about their own exposure to risks instead of the risks that their operations or supply chains may pose to the human rights and to the environment. Then companies select and prioritize specific risks to be addressed. And we found that the risks that they prioritize or discuss are the ones that are high on the global agenda or important for consumers, but they have largely disregarded impacts that have been particularly important for local communities, such as land rights or pesticide pollution. Then companies have also aimed to outsource their obligations to third parties, such as certifiers or auditors. And as Maria-Therese before already mentioned, such private and voluntary measures have often been quite deficient in many respects. So the question raises to what extent they will actually be able to address and mitigate and prevent risks in global supply chains. Finally, companies select what they want to report, and many of their reports are very superficial, and it's difficult based on these reports to know like what are really the risks, to trace supply chains and to trace impacts and to assess the adequacy of mitigation and prevention measures. In France, civil society organizations cannot just require the companies to disclose additional information that could be relevant for them. And interestingly, in the new Norwegian law that was adopted just a few weeks ago, this creates the opportunity to publicly request specific information from companies, and the companies have to respond within a quite short time frame. So this seems to be an interesting innovation in this regard. Then the French law is the only one to date that includes the possibility to bring companies that have caused or contributed to damages abroad to French courts. And the inclusion of civil liability in such laws has been a central demand of civil society organizations all over Europe, but it still needs to be seen to what extent this approach really fosters corporate accountability. In the case of France, civil society organizations and their counterparts from the global south have already filed 4 lawsuits against companies based on this law, and all of these lawsuits are still pending. And among these cases is one lawsuit against Casino Group because of alleged deforestation and also land grabbing in its supply chains from Brazil and Colombia. The company dismisses the allegations and argues that it is too difficult for them to know and also to control all of their direct and indirect suppliers. So this means that now all the eyes are on the courts to see how they will judge this case and how they will concretely interpret the obligations of the company or the companies. While France mainly relies on legal accountability for enforcing its law, we see that the German law foresees measures for supervisory accountability and administrative enforcement. And then Norway's approach relies on transparency and access to information. So it will be interesting to follow how these different paths for enforcing the laws will play out in practice. And by observing these processes, we think that we will also be able to draw important lessons for similar regulations that are currently under debate at the EU level and in other member states. So now, already to conclude, we think that supply chain regulations can contribute to corporate accountability because they fundamentally challenge the predominant idea that companies are only accountable for their own operations to consumers and shareholders, and attempt to hold companies into account for the impacts also of their subsidiaries and along their supply chains. Due to the establishment of different enforcement measures, the regulations create incentives to produce better knowledge for linking the local impacts to specific global supply chains and companies. And we also see the potential that supply chain regulations create opportunities for establishing closer networks between civil society organizations from the global north and from the global south. So for instance, in the case of Peru, we see that there the ombudsperson has been very active in monitoring, but also mediating mining conflicts, and it is very well connected internationally, also to the international human rights system. So we think that to further strengthen such transnational linkages will be important for enabling a meaningful implementation of the laws. Then on the flip side, we see that diverse constraints remain that could limit the effectiveness of supply chain regulations and that also merit further research. So first, we very much like the concept used by Tim Bartley of grounding transnational governance in order to trace the unfolding of transnational rules in domestic contexts. So for instance, in the case of Brazil, it can be interesting to see like how the supply chain regulations will interact and also be shaped by the domestic context and currently by processes of policy dismantling that we are seeing there. And moreover, we plan to study the consequences of supply chain regulations for different groups of actors like producers, smallholders, local communities, and indigenous peoples in Brazil. Second, we consider it to be important to study the linkages between environmental and human rights impacts in relation to the supply chain regulations. So many regulations focus either on the environment or on human rights. But we think that there are many problems on the ground that require more integrated approaches. So to give an example, addressing climate change in the context of the mining sector should pay attention to both environmental and human rights issues, because when you address climate risks only from an environmental point of view, this could have severe impacts on local communities, as their needs and rights would not be taken into consideration. Third, to conclude, when studying supply chain regulations, we find it very important to shed light into the question of how power relations shape both policymaking processes and the implementation and enforcement of laws, in order to better understand, or in order to understand these processes as being highly political, because they have the potential of fundamentally challenging and also restructuring the relationships between states, businesses, and societies. Okay, I finish, and I'm curious to hear your comments and also to engage in a discussion with all of you afterwards. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Maria-Therese and Almut. I don't know if you have decided which one of Tim or Tiago who would like to start, but we do have two excellent commentators.
Tiago, would you like to start?
Yes, up to you. If you already have some sharp points to point out, or I can start also.
I have points. I'm not sure they're sharp, but please go ahead.
Okay. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this debate. I think it's a very urgent and rich discussion, because we are on the verge of regulating these commodities, and it's a bit frustrating to see how long it took from our first insights about the drivers of deforestation to this actual real and effective governance process that is taking place right now. Anyway, so one point that I'd like to raise here is really about the role of the state. So as I said, it's a bit frustrating to see how late it came in, the role of the state, the role of the public authority in regulating these commodity supply chains that are crucial drivers of land use change. If we think of the current crisis, the multiple crises we are facing in terms of global climate change, global biodiversity loss, food insecurity, which are all intertwined, it's late. We should have done this earlier. Nevertheless, it's still important to recognize that it's still timely to regulate these companies and these supply chains, because it's been already more than 10 years that companies started to transform their sustainability pledges into what we call zero deforestation commitments. And research and many publications on the academic literature have been showing systematically that these zero deforestation voluntary commitments fail, basically. They are not delivering what they have promised. At most, they are simply clearing a company's own supply chain. And of course, collectively speaking, this is not desirable. This is not what we want as a society. So in this sense, it's fundamental to have this level playing field, and finally this is coming in. However, there is still a very important risk here that we see, particularly on the UK due diligence process, which is part of this environment bill that is going to be amended. And it relies fundamentally and crucially on the legality of how these commodities, these export commodities, have been produced. In contrast, the EU, the European Union regulations, they already mention and discuss situations that are more like related to absolute terms, for example, absolute deforestation or gross emissions or things like that. And this is more important because if we design consumer countries regulations that rely on producer countries regulations, we have the risk of these producer countries regulations being shifted over time. And I take Brazil as an example here, which is one of the most important food commodities producers in the world. As you might know, it's the key producer and exporter of soy, one of the top 5 for maize, cocoa, coffee, and other crop commodities. And since 2008, for example, the forest code, the Brazilian forest code, which is the main land use regulation, I would say, was revised, was substantially revised. And fundamentally, many areas that were illegally cleared and therefore needed to be restored for compliance were simply granted amnesty. So the production on these sites that were illegal up to 2012, they became legal after that. And in addition to that, there are probably dozens or more than that bills currently going through the Brazilian Senate and the chamber, the deputies chamber, to amend other environmental laws, such as licensing systems, land tenure regulation, facilitating land grabbing, for example, even the regulations on slave labor is threatened to be laxed, and the information about farms that were accused of slave labor, and currently we have a public list of these farms. This is being threatened to become opaque in the future. So if consumer countries approve legislation requiring compliance with producer countries' laws, it's basically, these countries are basically issuing this encouraging signal for producer countries to lax their legislations or to transform what's illegal today in legal into the future. So this is the great risk. In addition to all the complexities, all the difficulties that we have to monitor this compliance, because if you just request a document, you know, it's relatively easy to produce a document attesting that this product is legal. On the other hand, if you require, for example, absolute zero deforestation in the production of any agricultural commodity, you can monitor that from satellites. So it's more objective, it's more, how can I say, it's more transparent, and it's easier to enforce, monitor, and verify. So yeah, I think I should stop here. These are the major threats I would see in this entire governance movement. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I think I will give the word to Maria-Therese and Almut, and Tim, I will give you the word after. Would that be okay, Maria-Therese and Almut? Mm-hmm. That you comment on Tiago's comments, and we continue the discussion with Tim after that.
Who should start?
You can go if you want.
Okay, I go ahead. So I can really see the risk that you highlight of relying on legality, and I think that's really important to perhaps design the regulations in a way that they don't only rely on the legality aspect. Because when I'm thinking about the Peruvian mining industry, for instance, there are, and even though you base it on legality, there are so many ways of constructing the compliance with the laws that you have so nice laws and regulations in place that are never enforced. But at the same time, I also wonder about, I mean, there are governments and governments, like you have Bolsonaro, and then you had Lula, or you had the current Peruvian president, who is actually a rural leader. And I think that they are very important to what sort of domestic political environment you have, because there could be more or less opportunities to work with the sort of domestic actors. And I think that it's really hard also to improve anything without sort of answering this with the existing state institutions, because you cannot just like regulating things from abroad without having the sort of local civil society and so I'm just thinking about thinking about how the state is also constituted by many sort of complex entities. You have, like in the case of Peru, or in the case of Brazil as well, of course, like you have the ombudsman, you have the environmental ministry, and then you have an incredibly conservative and neo-extractivist environmental ministry, and sort of trying to sort of work and strengthening the progressive elements within the state and to sort of promote change from within. I don't know, like it's really hard to not sort of, but I understand really your criticism of the legality aspects, but somehow find a way to work with the state and strengthening the parts of the state that could sort of push change from within. Yeah, so that's just a reflection. Like
Okay, to complement, I agree that question about changing also the state from within and trying to find leverage points for some transformation, I think it's an interesting discussion. I'm curious to see what, Tiago, you think about that. And then I'm still thinking like about two things that you just said, Tiago. The first one is, like you talked about zero deforestation commitments and said that one of the shortcomings was that companies mainly use them like for cleaning their own supply chains. And I am wondering, like, to what extent there is also the risk that this could happen, like with the supply chain regulations that build on a due diligence approach, because they are like also requiring like the company to see like what happened in their own supply chain. So they have the possibility like to maybe withdraw from certain places that could be complex, or to use certain mechanisms like auditing and certification, trying to show that certain problems are not so important for their own supply chain. But I'm wondering, like, this is a question that I myself have. I don't know what you think about it. Like, to what extent this can like contribute to broader transformation also? Like that it's not only like this cleaning up. And because also if we think about Brazil, like the share of soy and beef, for instance, that they export to the European Union, it's like not so big. Like depending on soy, it's bigger. In beef, it's not so much. And there are like complex problems, and also other exporting or other countries they export to. So the problem is like if it's only like companies now from Europe that will be regulated, maybe the impact will not be so big. But I'm wondering about that. And then the second aspect that you talked about that I find interesting is about to think with the absolute zero deforestation, that it's somehow difficult when the companies or the due diligence systems, they rely on state data, and sometimes this state data could be like weakened, like in the case of the slave labor list, or also other public databases. And so like the solution could be like to use satellite data, which I find interesting. But on the other hand, I think like that only can be used for certain impacts and not for others. And so what do you think about that? Because you could complement it maybe with other measures, but then what to do like with that like pesticide pollution and land grabbing, because then you only focus like on deforestation. So these are like my 2 points.
So would you like to say something, Tiago, in response to Maria-Therese and Almut? It has to be very short, but because we need to give the word to Tim. But would you like to say something? Just add or comments, so to say.
Well, I think there are so many things I could say that I'd rather listen to what Tim has to say, and then I try to pack everything together in the end. Is that possible?
Excellent choice. So I give the word to Tim. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Christina. And thank you so much to everyone. I think what I want to do is start on exactly this point that Tiago made about the risks and potential benefits of focusing on law and domestic law. And then I'll come back to sort of my broader reactions to this project, which I think is outstanding. So I agree with the concerns that Tiago raised, that if we build a system of transnational governance that requires domestic legality, you might produce an incentive for the weakening of laws. And the examples that you gave, Tiago, I think are very powerful ones. So I agree. And yet, I find myself much more excited about this model of recentering domestic law than you are. And I think the reason is that I believe, as a kind of theoretical article of faith, maybe that's overstated, but I believe on some deep level that progressive social change happens through collective domestic struggle over the meanings of law, and not over satellite data, and not over appeals to distant CSR managers or even distant multi-stakeholder initiatives. And so I think descriptively and analytically, the big question is what happens within Brazil or within Peru or within Indonesia, which is a case that I'm a bit more familiar with, when these kinds of initiatives say we demand domestic legality. Well, in at least some circumstances, there is a kind of social movement mobilization on the ground to try to strengthen rather than weaken or allow law to be weakened. And I think one of the big questions that can come out of this, that should come out of this, is how do those mobilizations work and when do they pay off? When do they produce collective social change and when do they fail? And I think there's potential for both failure and success. But I think pretending that law doesn't matter, which is what CSR and multi-stakeholder initiatives have done primarily for the past 2 decades, is backwards and counterproductive. So that's my strong way of saying it, at least. Let me back up and make just a couple of other broad comments on this project. I think it's an outstanding project, and I'm really happy to hear all the different dimensions of it, particularly that you're able to look at both policymaking within the EU and on the ground processes in Brazil, Peru, and maybe beyond. And I'm also really excited that you're able to look at this interplay of human rights and environmental rationales and the extent to which they get intermingled in these fields or not, which is a big issue for timber. It's a big issue, I think, for fishing, illegal fishing, and whether that extends to forced labor on fishing boats and other things like that, and a big issue for agricultural industries as well. I'm also excited about this project because I completely agree that private voluntary initiatives have, for the most part, failed over the past 2 decades, and that we need a stronger role for the state if we are to really address these kinds of global challenges of climate change, deforestation, degradation of human rights, and labor rights around the world. Let me say 2 concrete things about that. So one worry I have is that although I agree with that diagnosis that the state needs to come in more strongly, and I think pretty large swaths of the research community would agree with that too, in some survey research that I've been doing, actually survey experiments that I've been doing in both the US and in Germany, we find that among the general public, people still give a lot of credence to claims that companies make to be solving the problem voluntarily. That is, in both the US and Europe, we found that people become less supportive of state intervention of the sort that we're talking about when told that companies are privately regulating or taking steps on their own. So in spite of the fact that we see, I think, the rise of these kinds of hardened global regulations, I think there is still a challenge of building support for those within the consumer countries, not to mention within producer countries. And this is actually, if anyone's interested, I'll be presenting a paper, or actually both sets of papers at SCORE in a couple of weeks, October 21st, on these survey experiments, which show this and other things. The second big question I would raise, which is what I started to say in part in response to this question about legality on the ground, is about coalitions. I think there's two big questions about how these new forms of new hardened regulations, or what I've sometimes called the hardening of soft law, depend on or produce new coalitions of businesses, civil society organizations, across different arenas. So maybe to start on the producer end, or on the site of production side, I think this is how I would come at this question of what the grounded politics of this looks like, is to what extent are there viable, robust social movement coalitions, and maybe coalitions between kind of radical social movement and reformist elements within government that can mobilize around legality or mandatory demands through the supply chain. But I also think the question of coalitions is important for thinking about the politics of this kind of hard global regulation within the EU, where potentially you might see some coalitions of actors from different countries, different sectors, or even companies that see themselves as already above the bar, if not promoting, as at least not fighting as hard against an attempt to raise the bar for others. There's a long line of research and theory that argues that some actors will actually prefer more stringent regulation, including companies would prefer more stringent regulations when they think it will raise the bar and eliminate advantages that their competitors, their less regulated competitors, have. To date, I've seen really little evidence that companies with leading CSR initiatives really do push for more stringent regulation. There are few examples, for instance, in the EU timber regulation case, but it's a handful of companies. But I think it's a possibility. Theoretically, I think it's an important possibility that leading companies that are subscribed to a variety of multi-stakeholder initiatives actually accept a hardening of those obligations. But it would also be interesting to look across countries. And I think important to look across countries to see if companies that are in jurisdictions that already have more stringent regulations through some of the national regulations that you talked about are actually in favor of pushing those throughout the EU, or maybe more likely, in my view, the move to the EU level produces a new round, a new arena for getting rid of those hardened obligations or weakening those to the point where due diligence means very little except for adopting a policy and disclosing a few things. Thanks so much for the conversation. It's a really outstanding project, and I look forward to seeing where it all heads.
Thank you, Tim. Maria-Therese and Almut, you maybe would like to answer the comments. But we also have some questions in the chat that we can come back to. But first, the screen is yours to answer Tim's comments, please.
Would you like to start, Almut, this time?
You can. I'm a slow thinker.
Okay, thank you so much, Tim. These were really excellent questions and really good reflections. I will just pick on a few questions there that you mentioned. Like, I think we have looked a little bit more closely into the sort of drafting processes in a couple of countries like France, Switzerland, and Germany. And there we saw that it's really coming from sort of civil society that are pushing for drafting these new law proposals. And there's a lot of advocacy campaigns, and with the French law, for instance, came as a reaction to the Rana Plaza accident. So I think that there are strong sort of civil society that are pressuring from these, even in importing countries. But then, of course, you have the companies that are very opposed. And what we have seen so far in the kind of discourse analysis that we are doing on these drafting processes in the 3 countries, companies are generally very critical of more stringent law proposals, and they are against legal liability. They want more like reporting obligations without any sanctions, without legal liability. Yeah, so that's the kind of landscape that we see in these drafting processes. And then I also think it's important questions about when you talk about how important the law is. And I just would like to share a reflection about that, because I think also I think it's important, the law in the producing countries, but I also think that this kind of possibility that we see in the French case, where you have legal liability and the opportunity to initiate lawsuits, it has really been like given civil society organizations incentives to build new coalitions. And I wouldn't say that this is kind of super strong and that we are seeing, but we see cases where coalitions between Latin American grassroots organizations and national organizations and organizations in France that have sort of trying to work to trace the origins of the products and been doing this over several years and to construct like solid evidence of where the products comes from and the impacts of the products. So I think that this is, and then of course it's all comes down to the power relations. Are these organizations and coalitions strong enough to really push back on the companies to do this in more than isolated cases? But what I think it's interesting in this case is that these are also kind of very visible campaigns around these lawsuits, which I think is also important for changing the norm and idea what the companies should do and to whom they are accountable. They are kind of a norm that saying that the companies are just not accountable to shareholders and consumers, but also so I think that this is kind of a powerful tool that is interesting to see what is happening with these sort of legal struggles and new coalitions. Yeah. Almut.
Thank you, Tim, for all of your interesting reflections and also for your encouraging words regarding our project. We are very keen to keep our exchange and discussion with you. I think I share many of your research interests, like with regard to the different coalitions on both sides, the demand side and then the supply side, and then also the transnational linkages that Maria-Therese mentioned. Something that I am still struggling with is what we have been talking about with Tiago and with you also, like with regard of this somehow interaction like between the supply chain regulations more from the demand side and then the state from the producing side, because I think it's complicated, because on the one hand, like I understand your argument, Tim, that it's very important like to have to struggle like for legitimacy and for laws that are supported by like collective actors within the countries. But then it's very difficult like when we see like that this is going into a wrong or a not so favorable direction, like in the case of Brazil, where we see like a shrinking of civic space and decreasing regulatory capacity of the state. So then, despite the fact that we could still like try to, as Maria-Therese said, like to support such local struggles and also to give voice like to rights holders, the difficulty is like where to get in. And I had the feeling like when I was in Brazil for the last time, like 1.5 years ago before the corona pandemic, that there was not so much movement like in a positive direction in that moment. And so the question is like how the like regulations from the demand side could maybe be used like to pressure also for change. Like I had the feeling that many people from Brazil were somehow waiting for some external pressure to trying to make some transformation. But I think more generally, like the question is like how home state regulations and host state law, how they interact, and to what extent also is it really possible like to complement or substitute for regulatory capacity on the producing side, or to what extent these attempts like from the demand side will be undermined by policy dismantling, for instance, in Brazil, to what extent they can escape or not, and how to deal with that. I think that's really one of the key issues and not so easy. And also I found like I have engaged a lot with literature on business and human rights and with legal scholars like arguing that homestead regulations and host state regulations should be like complementary, and when you have more on one side, it's better than nothing. And somehow I agree, but I think it's also not so easy because the interrelations are more difficult sometimes. Yeah.
If I can just follow up with 10 seconds. I mean, I think my presumption through all of this is that change is slow and not unidirectional, right? And so, yes, it's really difficult to see regulations being weakened on the ground and forests being much worse, forest protection being much worse, and respect for rights being much worse in Brazil. But I think, one response is to say, well, let's just find a technocratic way to fix that. And the other response, which I think is more productive, is to say, well, let's find ways to support social movements within Brazil that might actually be promoting some kind of progressive change. And just on Maria-Therese's response real quick, I certainly agree that it's not that companies would ever be driving this. If the business community is united, as a political sociologist, it's clear if the business community is united against a regulation of any sort, it will almost certainly fail. But sometimes there's some division within the business community, or some segment of the business community actually does agree to team up with civil society actors, and then you get more robust regulatory change. And so those are the kind of coalitions, not like business-led coalitions by any means, that I think are sort of promising and interesting.
If I may, I think that Tiago wants to make a comment here or reflection. Go ahead.
Yeah, just packing everything here. I might have misexpressed myself. I mean, I'm not this kind of neo-colonialist who believes that external pressure should define what's going on in countries. Of course, I, in principle and theoretically, completely agree with Tim and the need for strengthening civil society and social movements. And, in Brazil, we have this constitution from 1989, which is known and considered a social constitution because it was the result of these social struggles, and historically the environmental movement has been very strong in the country. However, we are watching this kind of regression in the country and in legislation. And what I mean by saying that consumer countries should kind of impose some criteria for what they import is because they have a role in demanding. This external demand for goods, for commodities, is somehow undermining the social struggles and the social movements in favor of these transnational corporations, or in favor of these local actors who are connected to transnational corporations. And in this sense, it doesn't mean that we should not rely on legality in producer countries, but we should go beyond. I mean, we shouldn't have a UK legislation stating that they will only import goods that comply with the legal criteria of producer countries. I mean, this is obvious. We shouldn't need this. I mean, nothing should be exported and imported if this doesn't comply with local regulation. But in addition to that, and considering that all countries in the world are making pledges and commitments and actions to mitigate their emissions, to reduce their biodiversity footprint, we should go beyond that. And going beyond that means, okay, we will only import products that, in addition to complying with local regulation, does not cause emissions, does not deforest, does not threaten human rights. As common global collective principles, I would say. But then just to say that this is something that should be additional to local legislation.
Thank you, Tiago. We are running out of time here, and I think that several of the questions in the chat has been partly answered by you during the presentations and the comments and the reflections. But Maria-Therese, would you like to say something about something additional? And we just have to wrap up and close this very interesting webinar on this very important topic. So the screen is yours, Maria-Therese.
Yeah, okay, very quickly then, just to follow up on what Tiago just said. I think that many of the kind of productions that we have in our global economy would be impossible if we should achieve that kind of sustainability, because like resource extraction or the soy and beef, I mean, it's really hard to make those commodities sustainable. So perhaps we should just change our capitalist system in a more transformative way. But I guess that's another question. But yeah, thank you so much. It was really, really nice to be able to share our research with you. And thank you, Tiago and Tim, for joining us. And thank you, everyone else. Yeah.
And thank you for presenting your ongoing research, and for us who are interested in this very important topic. We can follow you, and you will present, I guess, and publish in the future. So good luck with your research, and thank you very much for tonight.
Just to say that, please, anybody who wrote in the chat and we didn't have so much time to respond to questions, please write us directly, and we will be very happy to discuss with you and answer your questions with more time.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.